Hello, everyone. Welcome to my channel. Today, we're going to be discussing this very important concept that is statistics. Now, this topic is quite vast, so I'll be breaking this down into multiple videos. Before we get started, it is very important for you to know the difference between the word discrete and continuous. When I say the word discrete, you need to realize that means something that is countable. Or, in other words, I can say it's going to be finite. If I were to give you an example, I could say that perhaps if I were to write down -1, 1, -3, -2. So you can see that I've actually written down these numbers over here, and they're a mix of whole numbers and integers. So we classify them as discrete. Whereas if I were to talk about continuous, we say that it's going to be infinite. Or in other words, I can say that you will be given a certain range. For instance, I could say that I have a question that says 1 is less than x, that is less than 3. Now, if I were to ask you to list down the values of x, you could say that x could be 1.1, it could be 1.2, it could be 1.111, could be 1.5, could be 2.5, could be 2.99. So there's so many numbers that can actually, as in that lie between this range. That is why I say, or I classify this as continuous. Another thing that you should be familiar with is the difference between the word ungrouped and grouped data. So when I say the word ungrouped, as the name suggests, it means something that is not organized. You'll probably be able to understand this better if I were to show you an example. So let's say we have a certain sequence or a certain set of numbers that are given to you in this order: -1, -3, -5, -4. You can see that these numbers are not categorized in a table. This is why I call them, or we call them, as ungrouped data. And if I'm being more peculiar, I can say this is going to be ungrouped discrete data, because these values over here are discrete. In a very similar way, when I say the word grouped, you need to understand that in any question that is related to grouped, you will always be having a table. Now, can this exist as a discrete data, or could it exist as a continuous data? It can exist in both ways. And again, you'll be able to understand this better with probably an example that we'll be doing in just a while. But just to quickly, as in give you the gist, I could say that let's say we have these two columns. And the very first column over here represents the type of vehicle that we have. In a similar way, the second row over here, the second column over here represents the quantity. Now, let's say I'm talking about maybe some sort of sedans, and the quantity is maybe 4. Similarly, I'm also discussing some trucks, and let's say we have that as 5. So I could say that we have a total of 9. So you can see that instead of listing them as truck, sedan, instead they've actually put this in a table, which is again more organized. They've classified it into a type. So this classification over here is something that is only possible when it comes to a grouped data. Moving on, this chapter is something that comprises of two different aspects. One is to figure out the measures of average, and the other one is to figure out the measures of spread. When I say the word measures of average, that means we have three important subtopics in this. The first one is known as mean. Similarly, there's another one that is known as median. And finally, we have something known as mode. When I talk about measures of spread, in this case, we have range. Similarly, we also have something known as interquartile range, which is usually written down as IQR. There's also another topic that is known as variance or standard deviation. But again, this is something that is not included in O levels. So although this is also something that we classify in terms of spread, but this is something we won't be discussing because this is not a part of O levels or IGCSE. Now, let's try to dive into this concept as to how we figure out mean. I'm sure already all of you probably know this by now, that when I say the word mean, that means I'm taking the sum of all the values, sum of all numbers, over the quantity that I have. But please bear this in mind that this formula is only applicable for ungrouped data over here. When it comes to grouped, we have a different formula. We write it down as mean is equal to sigma fx over sigma f. Although they both have the same meaning, as in me writing down mean is equal to sigma fx over sigma f, or writing down the formula as sum of all numbers over n. This actually has the same meaning. It's just one is represented in terms of frequency. Which brings me to another point. What does f stand for? It stands for frequency over here. And this weird symbol that you see, which looks like an E, I feel like I struggle with actually drawing this properly. But anyways, so this is something we call as summation, which means that we are trying to take the sum, or we're just trying to add up all the values. Similarly, f over here represents the same thing. That's frequency. And x. Now, this x is a little confusing because x usually represents the value or the midpoint. You'll be able to, as in differentiate in between both of them, hopefully once we are done with one of the questions. In a similar way, we have the word median as well. The word median means middle value. Middle value. And not just the middle value, but there's a certain condition that we have. The condition states that you have to list down the numbers. If it's ungrouped, you have to list down these numbers in an ascending order. So that's one of the important conditions that we have, which has to be satisfied before we jump onto solving any question about median. If you don't do this, then your answer is going to be wrong. In a very similar way, there's a way in which we can figure out the median value as well. But there's no such formula that we have. It's something that gives us the term. So we say the median or the median term over here is something that can be calculated by n plus 1 over 2. Moving on to the third aspect, which is mode. When I say the word mode, it means something that is repeated most. I should also remind you that in this new curriculum, as in, I'm sure all of you who are watching this video, you will be sitting in the examination starting from 2025 onwards. And you need to realize that in your syllabus for O levels and IGCSE, they expect you to make an analysis as well. That means, yes, you will be calculating mean, yes, you will be calculating median and mode, but above all, you'll also be writing down a conclusion as to which one is the best, measures of average that we should be using in this question. And you need to realize it's going to be different for every question. So I can't just say that mean is something that's going to be helpful. Again, I'll help you understand the core concept as to which one is more applicable and when do we use which measure of average. But generally, you need to realize that you have to perform an analysis. This is, again, something recently added, so you won't be able to find any past paper questions on that. In a very similar way, when I say the word range, it means the highest value, highest or the biggest, largest value, minus the smallest value or the smallest number. There's multiple ways to write down this thing, but ideally this has the same meaning. So in certain, as in books, you might see that it says the biggest value minus the smallest value. Again, it has the same meaning, so it doesn't really matter. In a similar way, this IQR, this interquartile range, it's something we calculate using upper quartile minus lower quartile. Again, what does the word upper quartile, lower quartile means? You'll be able to understand this better, hopefully, in the videos that I'll be uploading, after this. So having said this, let's try a question. But before we do, I want you to pause this video and think for a second, what kind of data do we have? Is this grouped? I don't see a table over here. That means this has to be ungrouped. And what kind of ungrouped data do we have? Can I say these are discrete numbers? You can see the total quantity of these numbers are 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, which is again listed down in the question as well. So I can maybe write it down separately that the total that I have n value over here is 8. There are 8 terms over here. The first part of the question says find the mode. Now in this question, you can see that -1 is being repeated thrice, whereas -3 is being repeated twice. So if I were to compare between -1 and -3, I can definitely say that -1 is repeated the most. That means my value for mode is going to be -1. In a very similar way, I'll move on to the second part that says median. But if you were to scroll up, you'd realize I just made you write down something very important. I said for any question that is related to median, you have to first rearrange this in ascending order. So let's start doing it. Ideally, in the exam paper, I would recommend that you should have a pencil with you. The reason why I say that is because when you're rearranging this, so let's just start. So I'll write down the first number as -7. As soon as I do, with a pencil, I'll cross this out. You'll understand why am I doing this. In a similar way, the next number that we have is -5. Then we have -3, which is repeated twice. So let's also cross this out. Similarly, -1, -1, -1 thrice. And then finally, we have 2. So the reason of doing this exercise of crossing out this with pencil is so that you don't skip out a number. I've seen many students, they miss out a number. So once you cross this out with a pencil, I would expect as soon as you're done with the question, you should probably erase that mess. Now that we have this, again, let's figure out the median. Like I said, you can't figure out the median, but you can figure out the medianth term, for which we have a formula, which is n plus 1 over 2. That means in this case, n over here is 8. So 8 plus 1 over 2, which gives us 9 over 2, which is going to be 4.5th term. What does that mean? It means something that lies in between the 4th term and the 5th term. So you do understand that this is going to be my first term. That's going to be second. That's going to be third, fourth, fifth. That means I should be looking only at these two numbers. This over here is my 4th term, and this over here is my 5th term. If I were to take the average of this, I can say that my median is going to be -3 -1 over 2. I usually see some students, they get confused, -3 plus -1. Again, it's the same thing. Plus minus becomes minus. So don't get confused. -3 -1 over 2, that gives you -4 over 2. That's going to be -2. That means the final answer of this question is going to be -2. I hope this question is clear. Let's try another one. So again, if you look at this question over here, the question reads, 1 week, the temperatures in degrees Celsius at midnight were recorded. The fact that they've given us 1 week, this means in a week, how many days do we have? 7, right? So can I say n over here is 7? Let's count this as well. Let's make sure that, as in this count is correct. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So it does make sense. In a similar way, it says, use these results to find the mode. So again, the word mode means most repeated. So in this case over here, you can see that -2 is being repeated twice. That means I can write it down as my final answer. In a similar way, the fact they're asking us median, I told you earlier, the first thing that you do is that you have to first rearrange it. So let's start rearranging it. We'll start off with -3, cross it out. -2, again, that's coming twice. Then we have -1. Then we have 1. Then we have 2. Then we have 5. Should we place a comma over here? It doesn't really matter, so it's totally your choice. Now, again, we know the formula for median term is something that is n plus 1 over 2. 7 plus 1 over 2, that gives us 4th term. Everyone, please, I'd like to bring your attention over here. I've seen so many students writing down the answer as 4. That's wrong. For doing this, you won't get any mark. You need to realize this is something that only gives us the term where the median lies. So I can clearly see that 1, 2, 3, 4. That means -1 over here is going to be my median. In a similar way, we have the third part over here. So again, before we get started, what kind of data do we have? Can I say that's ungrouped again? Because I don't see a table over here. So it's ungrouped discrete data that we have. So to figure out the mean, I said sum of all the values divided by the n, the quantity that we have. So I know that in my denominator, I should be having 7. In the numerator, I should be having -1, -3, +2, +5, -2, +1, -2. Now, this is a question that came in paper 1. So you're not supposed to use a calculator. And ideally speaking, it's not really that hard. As in, I don't expect you to be struggling with this sort of arithmetic calculation. Anyways, this would come out to be 0 over 7. That means the mean over here is 0. Please don't assume that you figure out the answer wrong, because I've also seen some students, having this issue with mean as 0. It doesn't matter. It could be 0. And this is one of the past paper questions. So hopefully this gives you an idea. Let's move on. If you check out this question over here, my first question is, what kind of data do we have? Can I say this has to be a grouped data, right? This is grouped. And what kind of grouped data is it? Is it continuous or is it discrete? All I see is, as in whole numbers over here. So I can say this has to be grouped discrete data that we are having in this case. And I told you, if it's grouped, we write down the formula for mean as sigma fx over sigma f. It doesn't matter whether you write down f as capital. So in some, as in places, you'll see that it's written in this way. Again, it doesn't matter. It's the same thing. It's not case sensitive, all right? So like I said earlier as well, let's first solve the first part. It says write down the mode. Now, before you write down the mode, you do understand that in this case, it says Keith records the number of letters he receives each day for 20 days. That means this over here, everyone, is my n. But since this is a question that is based on frequency, this is the reason I would say that this is going to be my summation of frequency. That means it's the sum, it's the total frequency that I have. And I can actually prove this to you. If you start adding this column over here, 4 plus 6, that's going to be 10, plus 3, 13, 15, 16, and then we have 20. So the total of this is actually 20. So hopefully this is clear that in this question, I wouldn't call this as n, although writing this down wouldn't hurt your marks. As in, if you wrote this down as n is equal to 20, this wouldn't hurt your marks. But generally, you should stick to the convention and understand this is what the question is asking us. Now, again, this is all grouped, it's all organized. But if I were to, as an expanded, if I were to open this up, what does that mean? That means this letter 0, number of letters 0, is coming 4 times. So if I were to write this down, that means 1, 2, 3, 4. Then 1 is coming 6 times, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So, and the list goes on and on. Again, it's a huge sequence, right? Because we have a total of 20. So it doesn't make sense to have that as ungrouped. So I hope it's clear that whenever it comes to ungrouped, you will be having small data. That means it won't be this big of a number. Having said this, let's figure out the mode. The word mode means most repeated. So which number do you think is being repeated the most? 0 is being repeated 4 times, 1 is being repeated 6 times, and again, this list goes on and on. Please bear this in mind. You're never supposed to write down the frequency. I've seen many students writing down the answer as 6. That's wrong. 1 is the mode over here because that number is being repeated 6 times. So just like you see over here, right? As in this case, we can clearly see that 1 is being repeated 6 times. So I can say that my mode has to be 1. In a very similar way, the next part of the question says to work out the mean. So before we jump on to figuring out mean, we have already understood that this over here means the total frequency or the sum of frequencies. So I can plug in my denominator. I can say, well, the denominator has to be 20. Like I said, it's given in the question as well. You can count this as well. Either way, it gives you the same thing. Now, before I start explaining the concept, you should understand that these two letters, F and X, they're getting multiplied. All right? F times X. Otherwise, if it was plus, they would have written this down as F plus X. That's wrong. So it's written as Fx. Not only this, but X over here represents the value. Now, what is the value? I told you earlier, it could be value or it could be midpoint. So it might be helpful if you write this down as well, that if it comes to discrete, X is going to be the value. Whereas if it comes to continuous, X is going to be the midpoint. Please write it down. You'll probably be understanding this, once we start doing questions that are related to continuous as well. And you'll see there's plenty of those in the past papers. Now, in a very similar way, it says Fx. So for my convenience, this is something that is frequency. And X is this value over here. Will it always be the other variable? Yes. In discrete, it's always going to be the second row that is given to you, or column, whatever is given to you. All right. So I'll make another column over here and I'll label this out as fx. What does fx means? Multiplication, right, of f and x. Can I say if that is the case, let's start multiplying. If I were to multiply 0 and 4, what does that give me? 0. 6 times 1, that's going to be 6. 3 times 2, that's going to be 6. 3 times 2, again, that's going to be 6. 4 times 1, that's going to be 4. 5 times 4, that's going to be 20. So this is the total that I have. This is the fx, I would say, the multiplication of frequency and x that I have. This part over here, this Greek symbol over here, means that we have to add all these values. So I'll start writing this down. In the numerator, I'll write down 0 plus 6 plus 6 plus 6 plus 4 plus 20. This should be 30. And then we have 42. So we have 42 over 20 as the value that we get for mean. And if I were to simplify this, this would be 2.1. That's going to be my mean. If, again, a calculator is not allowed, you can easily simplify this. That's going to be 21. This will be 10. So that's going to be 2.1. And again, if you feel like the calculation is very hard and it's paper one, then you don't need to simplify. I mean, you just need to simplify the fraction. You don't need to convert that into decimals. So hopefully, everyone, I hope this concept is clear as to how we figure this out. But there's one more correction that I'd like to make. And that is, just for the sake of explaining this, I said that you can make this column. I wouldn't recommend doing this in the actual CI exam. So if I were you, I would rather write this down as a step. Let's see. So I'll start off with 0 times 4 plus 1 times 6 plus 2 times 3 plus 3 times 2 plus 4 times 1 and finally 5 times 4. We are still doing the same thing. We are still getting 4. We're still getting 0, 6, 6, 6, 4, 20. But instead of showing that as an extra column, I recommend doing this as a step. Why? Because this step over here contains the method mark. All right. So I would highly suggest that you do it this way. With this, everyone, we come to an end. We'll catch up again in another video. Till then, adios.